Good morning, everyone. It's time to begin our Bible study hour. I'm glad that you are with us this Lord's Day to study God's Word together. We're going to start in Genesis 45 today and see how far we can make it into our lesson this week, lesson 23. Does anybody need a hard copy of the lesson? There's a couple more in the back. All right, Genesis 45 is where I said we'll begin. And we will get into this lesson hopefully today. I have a feeling it'll be more detail next week on this scene that you see here of Jacob crossing his hands as he blesses his grandsons. So we ended off last week talking about this kind of the culmination of Joseph's story, the end of this, well, about a 4-week study that we've been in of Joseph going to Egypt, and now his brothers coming to Egypt to buy food, and him eventually revealing himself to them. And it's we talked about why he puts his silver cup into Benjamin's sack. And it seemed, as in our discussion, I think we saw that it wasn't just a way to get them to come back when they were on their way home, but it was a test. It was a way to say, hey, I will imprison or kill this man, Benjamin, and let you all go home. He said that multiple times in the story, just letting them all go, and he'll just keep Benjamin. And he wanted to see if they hated Benjamin the way they hated him so many years ago. And so it's Judah who steps up in verse 44, and he approaches, chapter 44, verse 18, he approaches Joseph, not knowing it's Joseph, and he says, please let me explain what's happened. He tells the whole story, right? Kind of giving this explanation of how they went home, they were unable to buy food without also bringing Benjamin with them, and how their father says, if I lose Benjamin, I'll die, right? And so they didn't want that to happen. What was it in Judah's defense that gave Joseph all that he needed to know? In Judah's defense, yeah.
I'll tell you what I wrote down here. When he defended Benjamin, it showed that they had repented and did not wish to repeat the old treatment that they had given Joseph. Judah was putting his life on the line for Benjamin.
Yeah, he was. Because at this point, they view Joseph as just this powerful, ruthless ruler of Egypt who's going to kill them for stealing, right? And they can't explain that they didn't really steal this cup. Somebody's going to die for stealing from the man who's second to Pharaoh. So after telling the story of what happened and saying that I've got to send Benjamin home or my father will die, verse 31, he says, like what he had told his father, verse 32, if I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. So he was willing to bear the blame for losing Benjamin. And then verse 33, now therefore please let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. So he takes his brother's place, a place of slavery or death or whatever may come to him. So I wanted you to see that parallel. Parallels between Judah and Christ are important. Go ahead, Jesse.
Maybe you already said this, and I can't think back to a week ago where you stated, but it's specifically brought out back in Genesis 37 that it was Judah who spoke up when he was in the pit and said to his brothers in verse 26, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our flesh. His brothers listened.
That's right.
So he wasn't a Reuben, because Reuben was going to bring him back to Dad. That was his plan. But Reuben was off somewhere, and then Judah stepped in and said, "Hey, let's not kill him, let's sell him." And Joseph probably heard that, and now he sees his total transformation and difference when Judah says, "Take me."
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. The whole idea of selling him into slavery was Judah's, better than being killed, but still, just like they had discussed in front of Joseph a chapter or so earlier, thinking that Joseph couldn't understand them, they said, didn't we not see the anguish of his soul when he cried out, not wanting us to sell him? So it's not like that was a pleasant alternative in any way. And so now he sees Judah coming to the defense of his brother Benjamin, which was good enough for Joseph. That was all he needed to know. How is that in some ways similar to what Christ has done for us? Norm?
Well, like in the example of Judah, you go from a person of extreme self-interest. We can see that in the Judah Tamar incident. We can see that in this incident that Jesse was talking about. It goes from this self-interest to it's all about me and what I can get out of this to total self-sacrifice in that. And that's the kind of transformation that we're asked to make.
Right, that's what Christ expects of us. He came as the one who was going to bear the blame that we have, right? So he takes upon himself the sins that we deserve. Think of Isaiah 53, right? Because of his stripes, or because of our sins, he receives the punishment. But then he also takes our place, takes the punishment. We could go on there, but I think we'll move on for the sake of time. So the last question from last week's lesson was about Joseph comforting his brothers. I want to read verses 1 through 15, chapter 45. And why don't we start over here with Gil, and we'll do 2 verses apiece, and go on back. Chapter 45, 1 through 15.
Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it.
Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt."
For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. I'm so sorry, I skipped 5.
You want to start over in 5?
Yes, please. So sorry.
No problem.
But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God has sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting.
And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and the Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout the land of Egypt.
Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, "Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Jerusalem, and you shall be near me, you and your children, and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have."
There I will provide for you, for these are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you.
Now you must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. And then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept on them, and afterwards his brothers talked with him.
All right. Such a beautiful scene, right? Joseph, as we said, he'd gotten all that he needed to know about his brothers and their remorse and their change of heart, no longer hating the sons of Rachel, but actually protecting Benjamin. And so he sends everybody out to have a private moment with his brothers, and then begins to weep. And having sent everybody out, they still heard, right? Because he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it. Verse 2, even the household of Pharaoh hears it. He says, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? Right? That's the first thing on his mind. He wants to know for certain. They've stated a couple of times that their father's still alive, but I guess in his lack of trust, he's still wanting now this confirmation. He hasn't seen his father, of course, but he desperately wants to know that he's alive and well and to see him again. I'm sure, and it says that they're dismayed and they are probably in disbelief because they've been looking at this man now for quite a while and hadn't recognized him yet. But what does he do to comfort them? What does he explain, Shirley?
He said, God sent me to preserve the prosperity for you in the earth and save lives for a great deliverance.
That's right. And I'm guessing the word there is posterity, right? A posterity. What does that word mean? So there's two words in the English language, prosperity and posterity. They're different words. What's posterity? Descendants, right? It's people who proceed from you. So he's sent me into Egypt to preserve a lineage, right? He wanted this lineage to continue. So that's right. He wanted, or as verse 5 in the New American Standard says, he sent me before you to preserve life. And verse 7 says he sent me before you to preserve a remnant in the earth. That theme of the remnant is going to continue through the scriptures, by the way, right? Where else are we going to see that theme?
Israel coming back from captivity.
Right.
A remnant.
Yeah, from captivity. And the idea there is God's looking for the faithful few. He's behold the kindness and severity of God. If people are unfaithful, he's willing to cut them off. Just because you're God's chosen people doesn't mean he won't cut you off. But it's the faithful ones who will be preserved as a remnant, like the last little piece of cloth when everything else is gone. And so here it's the same idea that everybody's dying or will die if this famine is not, if God doesn't help them through this famine, but he's here preserving a remnant who will survive in Egypt and in Canaan, in that land. How else does he comfort his brothers? Anything else that you wrote down? Just didn't want to miss anybody else's comments there. Of course, he notice what he says in verse 8. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Interesting that he calls himself a father to Pharaoh. It's possible that Joseph is older than Pharaoh, right? They might put a man on the throne who's still young when he ascends to the throne. And so how old is Joseph at this point? Anybody do the math? Brother Waldron kind of helped us with it. I think he's 39, because he's going to specify, verse 6, there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. So they're 2 years into the second 7 years. So that makes him 39, since he was 30 when he stood before Pharaoh and interpreted his dreams. So he's 39 years old, and he considers himself in some ways a father to Pharaoh. Whether or not their age is such way or not, regardless, he's the one who's telling Pharaoh what he needs to do. And so Pharaoh's looking to him. Whenever there's a problem, go to Joseph. He's got the wisdom. He's got the spirit from God that Pharaoh is able to see and recognize. But this whole idea that it wasn't you that sent me to Egypt, it was God. What a perspective, right? I'm sure when someone in our lives does something bad to us, it's easy to want to assign blame. Look what you did to me. And that can well up in our hearts, and we can feel like we want to get some revenge. Norm?
Yeah, it reminds me of Peter when the men were thinking, getting ready to bow down to him and everything. He said, no, I'm just a man. And just, knows who to give the credit to with that.
Right, that's right. And so it was clearly now to Joseph, it was clear that God had caused these events to take place. Of course, he's had the dreams. He knows receiving these dreams as interpreted by God and able to bring this great prosperity to Egypt. So he sees God's providence. So what can we learn about God's providence from this story that we can apply to ourselves? Norm?
Patience.
Patience?
Patience is critical.
It didn't come right away. Yeah, and he didn't have God, whispering in his ear saying, "Don't worry, Joseph, I've got a big plan." No, he had to sit in that prison and wonder, how is this part of the plan? Sam?
God has no problem using evil in order to propel his plan and to put it into action as well.
Yeah. Right, evil things are going to take place on the earth. God knows it, and yet his plan will be fulfilled, regardless of what evil men may do, sometimes in spite of what they do. Any other thoughts on providence, Norm P?
I think it's interesting that Joseph, at the time that he was sent to slavery with the youngest son, and it was very late in life that Jacob made the determination, God is now my God.
You're talking about Jacob or Jacob? Okay.
When he left Cain, or when he left his brother Esau,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, if I get back, then I'll know safely that I'll know you're God.
Right.
And so, and nearly at least 14 years passed just in his servant, just to get Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
And he had those sons in that interim, during that time when he was with Laban. And it wasn't until he got all the way back with his whole family, Joseph being one of them, brand new, that he finally made the determination, I'm going to follow God. And the impact that must have had on Joseph to be so keyed in on something that Jacob had just started with.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of a cautionary tale that of all the other brothers, it's Joseph the one that has the faith necessary for this journey.
Mm-hmm.
And none of the others, not even Judah.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, Joseph certainly learned about God from his father in his 17 years at home. Bill?
It's a good example of what we read in Romans 8, verse 28, that we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose.
Yeah, thank you for bringing us over there. Romans 8:28. It's a passage that I think is one of the more familiar passages to us. Even in denominations, they'll look at this verse. All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And so that doesn't mean everything that happens in our life is going to be good. But all things are working together to result in something that is good. Even the trials, right? We've talked about that and how trials can produce endurance, which have their perfect result, where we are able to endure to the end. Is there another comment?
Yeah, just on the Romans 8 there, the idea being that we need to look for and anticipate the good in everything. And
Right.
this is where we can, our attitude can change immediately. We can see the benefit. We can't see exactly what the benefit is, but we know to look for that and be watchful for the means of escape in the temptation. All of these things God promises he will provide for us, but we have to look for it. And this puts us in the mindset of our job is to look for the good in
Right.
every circumstance.
Sure. Wherever you go, just like God's going to tell Joshua later, the Lord will be with you wherever you go. So Joseph, same thing. He's in a foreign nation, and guess what? God's with him. It's not where he intended to be. He thought he would be in the land of Canaan with his father. But the same can be true of us, where we find ourselves in a place where we didn't plan to spend our life, didn't plan to go to college or whatever it is, but we can serve God there and make a difference in the kingdom wherever we find ourselves. That's right. I'm blanking on Mark's last name. Yeah, are you thinking about Mark Dunnigan as well? He had some great points in his lessons about how You know, he was late for a doctor's appointment and ended up sitting in a parking lot, and then that sister that he really needed to reach out to just goes walking by. And it's like, hey, maybe this is why I'm here. Maybe this is why I was late for my doctor's appointment today. So just looking for the good that comes from whatever situation God puts us in. Who can we help? Who can we share the gospel with and let our light shine? So that helps me to understand the providence of God. You see it working in Joseph's life. You see how he's preserving the life of his people through this story. I want to talk a little bit about Joseph. Andy sent me this snip from, this is the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. But thinking about Joseph and the comparison to Jesus, it's more profound, I think, than I had realized. It says, Joseph stands out among the patriarchs in some respects with preeminence. His nobility of character, his purity of life and heart, his magnanimity as a ruler and a brother make him, more than any other Old Testament character, an illustration of that type of man which Christ was to give to the world in perfection. Joseph is not in the list of persons distinctly referred to in Scriptures as types of Christ, the only perfectly safe criterion. But none more fully illustrates the life and work of the Savior. He wrought salvation for those who betrayed and rejected him. He went down into humiliation as the way to his exaltation. He forgave those who, at least in spirit, put him to death. And to him as the Savior, all must come for relief or perish. Those last 4 points really struck me, just how deep the connection there is. That everyone had to come to Joseph or perish, just like how everyone has to come to Jesus. He's the way of salvation, right? People who had betrayed and rejected him had to come back humbly to Joseph, just like we who betray and reject Christ have to come to Jesus and beg for forgiveness. And this humiliation path, we've talked about that a little bit. But this point that he forgave those who, at least in spirit, put him to death. Did they not? They all assumed that he was dead. They considered themselves as having killed their brother. That's why they felt so guilty, and yet he forgives them. And that's this beautiful scene we just read where he's embracing them and weeping on each brother, just happy to see them. That's the same emotion that you might feel when you meet your Lord, that he's happy to see you, even though you sinned against him and don't deserve his great salvation. Sam?
I guess, following these lines, you can see how forgiveness was extended to his brothers. Like Joseph first, did the whole thing with the cup and put in Benjamin's sack, and he had to wait for them to display some form of repentance for what they have done.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until after he saw that he went and revealed himself to them and told them all these things.
Right.
I think that fits along with the pattern that we see with Christ. When he died and he was resurrected, and then the apostles, Peter, were speaking to the Jews on the day of Pentecost. It wasn't until after he delivered the gospel to them, and some of them were cut to the heart, that salvation was open to them.
What a great point. Fantastic. Because there's nothing they could, when they said, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" in Acts chapter 2, there's nothing they could do. They couldn't uncrucify the Lord and undo what they had done. No, all they were expected to do was to repent, to change their heart, and then be baptized for salvation. But the same thing with Joseph. He's looking for a change of heart. They couldn't fix what they had done, but he wanted to see if their heart had changed. That's what God looks for in each of us. So there's 14 things that are listed here, and I can send this to anybody who's interested in studying it more. 14 things that are parallel between Joseph and Jesus that this author put together. Beloved of his father. Told he would one day rule. Of course, that was known in the prophecies of Jesus, but also even as a child when he was presented at the temple. Sent by his father to seek his brother's welfare. Of course, that's part of Jesus' story arc as well. Went to his brethren willingly. Envied and hated without cause. Rejected and condemned to die. Sold for silver. There's a detail. I think it was 20 pieces of silver for Joseph, 30 for Christ. He became a servant. He was falsely accused, treated as a criminal, proved to be a great counselor, promoted to glory and honor and given a new name, and all were commanded to bow before him, and he provided for all in need. Quite a few parallels there. Really interesting study. All right, any other questions on lesson 22 that you had? If not, moving into lesson 23, which is chapters 46 through 48. Now he's asked his father to come down. Of course, the brothers return in chapter 45, and they tell their father that Joseph is alive. And he can't believe it. But it says, when he saw the wagons, verse 27 of chapter 45, when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Then Israel said, "It is enough, my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." What a joyful moment to realize that he gets to ride in Pharaoh's wagons down to Egypt to see his son that he's missed for all these years. So question 1 on this week's lesson. Sorry, I got him out of order here. Jacob, on his way down to Egypt, the place that he stops at is the city of Beersheba. And we'll talk about the message that Jacob gets from God there at Beersheba. Why would Beersheba be the kind of the last stop? It's a geography question. Well, you're headed south, right? You're headed down to Egypt. Beersheba was like the southernmost city in the land. Remember who dwelt in Beersheba for a little while? Isaac. Isaac was in Beersheba. Of course, he had gone kind of toward the coast and then ended up in quarrels with the Philistines, and so he ends up in Beersheba, where after digging a few wells and getting run off. So yeah, Beersheba being the southernmost kind of city there, he stops there and he receives a vision from God. He's about to leave the land, right? And that's been a big no-no, right? You're supposed to stay in the land. And so verse 2, God speaks to Israel in the visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob," and said, "Here I am." And he said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes." So I asked you to list some of the promises that God gives to Jacob. What do you have?
Well, he promised he would make him a great nation. You repeated that portion of the promise.
So we've got 3 promises, the main promises, right? The nation, the land, and the seed. And so this first part is going to happen. And where's it going to happen? In Egypt. I will make you a great nation there. This is an important thing to track. As we go through our studies, we're moving into Exodus next quarter. We're going to see, especially as we get into Joshua and Judges, we're going to see these promises get fulfilled. And there are some today who claim that these promises have yet to be fulfilled. And they look at these events happening in Palestine as, oh, maybe that's about to be fulfilled. No, God said certain ones were fulfilled at certain times. Here is telling us it's in Egypt that they become a great nation. And then we're going to see when the land promise is fulfilled. And then we know that Jesus is the seed. So there's no other promises to Israel that we're looking for God to fulfill. He's already done that. In what 2 senses will God one day say, "Out of Egypt I called my son"? Now, that's a quote from Hosea 11, verse 1, if you turned over and looked at that. So that's a quote that we're familiar with, not really because we read Hosea all the time, but because where else is it mentioned? Out of Egypt I've called my son. What story is that a part of as well, Dad?
When Jesus was born, when Joseph and Mary had to take him down to Egypt to avoid Herod's killing spree.
Mm-hmm.
They, of course, came back later.
And then Matthew tells us this was to fulfill this prophecy, out of Egypt I have called my son. Now, when you're reading the book of Hosea, it doesn't seem very prophetic. It's just a description of what God had done. So in what sense was it originally true? Right here, right? This is the story. He's sending his son, and which son would he be referring to? Benjamin, maybe? I'm thinking a little higher on the family tree. Because he's speaking singular. He's sending his son and then calling his son back out. And that son is who? It's Jacob, or it's Israel, right? And we see how they're toggling between Israel and Jacob when they refer to him in these chapters. But Israel is Jacob. And we know Jacob's going to die in Egypt. He's not going to physically make the journey as a living son. But God's going to call his son Israel out of Egypt. And later he's going to do the same thing with Jesus. And it's like, oh, okay, that's an interesting parallel. But what I see there is these two sons of God. And we're going to talk about Ephraim and Manasseh probably a little bit and then more next week. And what's the pattern you continue to see in the blessing of these two sons? It's happened before. Right? They're very careful Joseph's very careful to put his oldest on Jacob's right hand so that he can get the greater blessing because he's the oldest. Jacob's old and his eyes are dim and may not know the boys real well, doesn't know who's the oldest. And so, but then he clearly does know, and he crosses his hands and he blesses the younger son. And so that pattern, we keep seeing it. When God repeats something like that all the way through the story, it's got to mean something. He's done it with Jacob and Esau, right? Here, and it was remember the birth story of, was it the sons of Tamar? Where one of them sticks his hand out and they put that's Jacob and Esau. It's the sons of Tamar, right? You guys probably know the story better than I do.
Jacob and Esau, grabbed Esau's heel.
Right. Yeah, no, but it is the thread. Yeah, that's right. So it's the sons of Tamar that Perez and I can't remember the other boy, but he sticks his hand out, pulls it back in, and then the other boy is born first. And so you see this younger overtaking the older. The point that I see is a lesson about Jesus, right? A lesson about the sons of God. In a sense, which son did he call out of Egypt first? Israel, right? Out of Egypt I called my son. So Israel is referred many times as a son of God, right? That he wanted to be faithful to him and was a disobedient son. And so then he's going to send his true son. Is Jesus the firstborn? He's going to be called the firstborn in many ways. He's called the firstborn over all creation, right? He's called the firstborn from the dead. Do you have to be the first one out of the womb to be the firstborn? No. That's the point that he's trying to show us. God, what makes Ephraim the firstborn? Jacob chooses him, right? God's will. What makes Jacob the firstborn? He was chosen. And so it's God's choice. And we all have to submit ourselves to God's choice. He chose to elevate his son, Jesus, to his right hand. And of course, Jesus is worthy, and he is the Christ, of course. But in choosing Christ, imagine being part of the nation of Israel. And now this, they think they're God's chosen people, and then they're supposed to follow this one. Even the brothers of Jesus, you get closer and closer to Jesus, and you see this disdain for, why would I serve him? He's part of my family. And they reject Jesus. But God sets him on the throne, and everybody is expected to bow and to serve. God has the right to choose. Yeah, Jesse.
We're referred to as the firstborn ones, registered in heaven in Hebrews 12:23.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. So we are the body of Christ, and so we are getting to take part in those blessings of the firstborn. Yeah, I'm sure there's layers to that we could explore. Okay, so question 2, how many were there in the house of Jacob who went down into Egypt, according to Genesis?
Genesis, New King James translation, 70.
Okay, so there's 2 numbers in chapter 46. If you look at verse 27, it does get to the number 70. There were 66, verse 26. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, his direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2. So all the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. Okay, so you got 66 plus Jacob himself, Joseph, and 2 boys. So that gets you to 70. Now, I wanted you to notice that Stephen retells this story in Acts chapter 7. What number does he give? He gives 75. So the Brother Waldron gave a good explanation of that. Did anybody note what that was and jot that down, how the explanation is given? The Septuagint. So sometimes you'll see LXX, and that's a Roman numeral 70, which is just the accepted symbol for the Septuagint version, which was the Greek Old Testament.
I suppose Jewish scholars, the number of men that worked on it
Right.
was 70, 72 is the number given.
Right. And so what extra detail was given in the Septuagint that got it up to 75? Did you guys note that? Dad?
Well, in the book there, in Waldron book, it talks about several grandsons of Joseph, I guess it would be. Let's see, there was Galad, I guess you'd pronounce it Galaad,
Mm-hmm.
who was the son of Maker, who was one of, one of the sons born to Manasseh through Maker. And then of the sons of Ephraim, they have the brother, who was the brother of Manasseh. You have Sutallam and Tom, I guess you pronounce it. And the sons of Sutallam were Edom. So I count 4. I don't know how you got 5. I got a little confused there.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some details there. There's also the detail of that 2 of Judah's sons have already passed away, right? But that seems to be they seem to be included in the count as well. The point is, there's extra Jewish writings around the scriptures themselves, and the Septuagint writers may be including some of that information when they record the Old Testament in Greek. So it's just good to be aware of that. Not a huge issue, because obviously there's going to be a lot more sons of Jacob further on down the line. But the Old Testament, translated from the Hebrew, and most of our Bibles are coming more directly from Hebrew texts, are giving us the number 70, whereas in the first century they would have been using that Septuagint version that had the number 75 that Stephen quotes from. Okay, just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. So Jacob's statement before Pharaoh is somewhat of a sad statement. He says in chapter 47, and I know we're jumping ahead in the story, Jacob comes to Egypt. He sees his son Joseph. Joseph weeps on his neck and is They're so happy to see each other. They dwell in the land of Goshen. And then Jacob goes before Pharaoh. Chapter 47 and verse 9, we'll start in verse 7. It says, Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, How many years have you lived? So Jacob said to Pharaoh, The years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and unpleasant, New American Standard, have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. Few and evil, he describes his life. In what sense would you say that is true? Or would you disagree? Maybe he's just being too negative. Norm? We'll go to Gil.
There was a lot of testing. He needed a lot of testing in his life to be able to purify that life and get to the point of what he needed to be for God's purposes to be fulfilled. And he seems to have understood it in looking back. As we all do, we review our lives, and he could see all those mistakes that he made and the different things that it took him to get here.
Yeah? Gil, anything to add?
Just that, I mean, he thought for the majority of his life, well, not the majority, a big portion of his life, thought that Joseph was dead, and so maybe he was grieving for that, so that might have been unpleasant, obviously.
Yeah? Jesse?
You can go back, and he had a brother that hated him, wanted to kill him. He had to flee from home. Then he had a father-in-law that deceived him, gave him the wrong daughter as wife. Worked another 7 years, 14, 20. He changed my wages, 10 times? And so the way Laban dealt with him, then he leaves, and then, he thinks his favorite son is dead, and he's grieved over that. And, there's been some trouble.
Yeah, there's been some trouble. Just one problem after another. There's not really a long span where everything's great in Jacob's life. No, he's always had some problem, and maybe to Norm P's point, right? He's not that strong of a man of faith in his younger years. He's a supplanter and a deceiver, and to forge the man who would be called Israel, these trials come. Norm?
Reminds me a lot of Solomon in Ecclesiastes, and as good a life as he had, compared to this, he lived Solomon lived the good life, and then learned the lessons. He lived this rough life, but again, looking back on it, it was God who needed to test and purify and mold these individuals, and it took in one case, it took all good stuff that ended up being bad, and here all bad stuff that ended up being good. It's interesting that, like going back to Sam's point, God can take us and use
That's right.
whatever.
God speaks to him in Beersheba before he leaves the land and says, Joseph will close your eyes. And what a blessing, or to think of what a wonderful ending of his life that will be, that he's going to be there with his beloved son. But, the God had let him wonder all those years. That same God who can give him a vision in the night and tell him, he didn't tell him. Joseph's still alive. Don't worry. He's down in the land of Egypt. No, he lets him wonder all those years, and yet you don't see Jacob blaming God or angry with God. He had received a dream from his son Joseph about us all bowing to him one day, and perhaps that carried him through. But few and evil were the years of Jacob's life. 130 years were few in comparison to perhaps his father and grandfather who lived much longer. All right, we'll pick up there next week.